let me introduce our moderator. And Joseph, come on up, if you would, please. So Joseph Blocher is going to moderate our panel today, and we picked the right guy. Joseph is the Lanny L. Smith Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke Law School, and his scholarship focuses on issues of gun rights and regulation, free speech, and also the relationship between law and violence. And I remember when we first chatted about this, and I think he said to me, this is going to be a tough thing to pull off in the way that we envision it. But I thank you for being willing to take on this role. Joseph is also the co-director of the Center for Firearms Law at Duke University, and you co-founded that as well. And he's testified before the House and Senate committees. He's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, Vox, and other public outlets. So I know that we're going to leave this in your expert hands, Joseph. We'll let you welcome everybody else to the stage. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Kirk. And I would love to have the rest of this fantastic panel join me. I was nervous when we first put this together, Kirk, because we didn't have the panel set, but then once we got this fantastic group of folks, I'm no longer nervous. I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation. But again, thanks to Kirk and everybody else who's working behind the scenes to make this event flow as smoothly as it has. It is my honor and privilege to be moderating this conversation. I'm going to briefly introduce our fantastic panel, give a few comments just to kind of situate where we are in the gun debate today, and then we'll run through some questions, and we'll certainly leave some time at the end for Q&A. So get your questions ready. But maybe I'll just start by introducing the folks here, starting to my far left. We have Ashley Hlebinsky. Ashley studies firearms history, technology, culture, and society. She aims in her work to provide an apolitical, science-based approach to understanding the issue. She was formerly the curator of the Firearms Museum in Cody, Wyoming. We were just talking about it backstage. If you ever find yourselves in Cody, I highly recommend the museum, which Ashley really helped build. It is an unbelievable place. More recently, she helped co-found the Firearms Research Center at the University of Wyoming School of Law. After that, we have David Joy, a novelist and short story writer who lives not too far from here, over in Jackson County, I believe. Do yourselves a favor, if you haven't already, and pick up a copy of David's novels. I saw that they're on the table outside. My personal favorite, which I think was this debut, is Where All Light Tends to Go. Was that the first? Fantastic book. And I overheard David saying there's another book coming out in August, and that would be Those We Thought We Knew. Yeah. So pre-order that. They're all wonderful. He has written really with real passion and insight about gun ownership, gun violence, and gun culture. After David, we have Kelly Sampson. Kelly is Senior Counsel and Director of Racial Justice at the Brady Center. She is especially interested in addressing gun violence's disproportionate impact on communities of color. She does that as a litigator, a commentator, and a scholar. One of her works that I like the best and refer to often is called The Right Not to Be Shot. You can download that for free while you're online ordering David's books. It's a really wonderful piece. And then finally, to my immediate left, Chris Singleton. Those of you who were at the event last night are fortunate enough to know a little bit of Chris's story. We'll hear more about it today. But 8 years ago tomorrow, I guess it was, Chris lost his mother in the Charleston tragedy, about which I'm sure he'll speak. He has taken that event and transformed it into something amazing, a message and really a life dedicated to, among other things, the proposition that love is stronger than hate, and also some really innovative approaches to solving gun violence. So we have a wonderful panel. We also have a lot to talk about, so I just want to briefly situate why I think this conversation is so important to be having now. I think one could make the claim, and Kirk was sort of suggesting this, that this is, of all the issues in American law and politics, the hardest for people to talk rationally about. It is also one of the most important issues facing the country right now. According to the most recent CDC data, 45,000 Americans lost their lives to gunshots in the most recent year for which we have data. The majority of those were deaths by suicide. If you add in the people who were shot and survived, the casualty number gets to about 100,000. which I think is truly extraordinary. Those casualties are not evenly distributed across the population. Kelly may speak to this. They are, especially the gun homicides, heavily concentrated in communities of color. Young black men, who make up about 2% of this country's population, account for almost 40% of its gun homicides. With suicides, the numbers look very different, concentrated much more heavily in white men, older, and especially in rural areas. So the size of the problem, I think, is enormous. On the other hand, it's really important to emphasize that tens of millions of Americans own guns and use them for perfectly legal and even laudatory reasons. It's hard to know the number, but probably as many as hundreds of thousands of people use guns every year for self-defense. People use them for recreation. They use them for hunting. And in fact, since 2020, we've seen a big spike in gun purchases. Many of them seem to be first-time buyers and a more diverse set of buyers than in the past. More women, more people of color buying guns for the first time. Now, one of the big challenges for law, which is where I spend most of my time, is figuring out how to balance these sort of costs and the benefits of something like gun ownership. And so therefore, it is also important to note that last summer we had the first major Second Amendment decision from the Supreme Court in almost 10 years, something that Kelly can help us unpack, as well as the first major federal gun law in almost 30 years. So a lot has been changing at the legislative level. Politically, alas, the gun issue continues to get more divisive. It is, according to some polls now, about a 60-point gap between Republicans and Democrats on the issue of whether gun rights or regulation are more important. That dwarfs the division on any other issue, abortion, affirmative action, anything else. It is, at least in that way, the most divisive issue in American politics. So these four are going to figure it out for us. We got about an hour now that I've set it up that way. I'll start with you, Ashley, and I just painted, I think, a very dark picture of kind of where we are right now, which I didn't really intend. But one of the things that I find so striking about the gun debate is that although it is driven by immediacy, like a thing that just happened, we were talking about this backstage as well, or what current bills are being proposed, it's also deeply rooted in an understanding and sometimes misunderstanding, I think, of gun history, which is where you've spent a lot of your time. So if you could say a little bit about how you got there and what you find.
So to give you kind of a perspective, I've been given about 5 minutes, and firearms history is about 1,000 years. So I'm good, but I don't talk that fast. So just a few words on my background, because I do not look like most gun curators, is that I did not grow up around firearms at all. I never even encountered a firearm until I decided to study them from a museum perspective. And so, and to be honest, no one in my family ever talked about firearms. So when I came to the study of firearms history, it was very much blind to the political debate surrounding firearms, but then also, any of the technology. So I went from never holding a gun or knowing anything about a gun on my 18th birthday to being a liberal East Coast city girl that was dropped into a town in Wyoming of 9,000 people to run one of the largest gun museums in the country at 25. So it was a lot, but I've learned a lot from it. And so what I wanted to have a few remarks on, because this is a trend I see within firearms history, is this concept of interconnectivity and the ability to use history as a vehicle to have productive dialogue, because it doesn't have to be intrinsically political. So the first thing that I kind of noticed when I got interested in museums is that gun museums kind of follow the same trajectory as art museums, although I'm sure art museum people would want to disagree with that a lot. But they are, because they're very collector-based, and the display techniques that I saw when I first went to Cody were also very gun as art. So you would either have the firearm on display as an art piece, or they'd be intricately laid out like art, but there was very little context. So if you weren't in the know, you'd go into a firearms museum and you could look around and you'd be like, great, I know nothing more. I use my mom as an example. The first time she came to Cody, we've got 7,000 firearms in that collection. She walked in and she was like, this is cool, good job. I have no idea what's happening. So I ended up rebuilding the Cody Museum. We completely gutted it and we reopened it. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we did was move it from being a firearms museum to a firearms history museum. Because when I started studying guns in museums, I realized quickly that there were firearms or some related artifact in pretty much every museum in the country. Art museums, natural history museums. And when you don't have any context of how integral firearms have been to understanding history, society, you kind of wonder why they're there. And as I started researching this, I realized that guns, for better or for worse, and there's good and bad examples of it throughout all of history, they've been so connected to industry, society, culture. And the examples that I'm going to use, because I think you'll know most of the people associated with this, but you might not know that they're connected to firearms. And it kind of, totally threw me for a loop when I started studying it. It's not necessarily what you get in school. But Eli Whitney, who people know, you're very excited about that. Oh, okay. Well, then I will be really polite about Eli Whitney. All right, good. So everyone knows Eli Whitney from the cotton gin, interchangeable parts. But what people don't realize that he got a contract to make 10,000 muskets in 1798. He had not made guns before, did not go super well for him. And the concept and the conversation about interchangeable parts ended up when he couldn't actually deliver his guns, and everyone got really mad at him. So he went and did this big display. Was like, look, I'm a genius, but it was staged. So he didn't really completely do interchangeable parts. But Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, very much associated with firearms history. Another one that I use is that Henry Ford actually visited the Winchester factory in 1909, so 1 year before he built his Highland Park factory in Detroit. And so it very much informed the way that he improved upon it, but the assembly line and the inline manufacturing processes that the gun business had been doing since the middle of the 19th century. So it's interesting to see that connection. And the automobile industry also comes up a lot. A lot of people do know that General Motors made firearms and gun parts during World War II, but also the inventor of the silencer, which is a sound suppressor, Hiram Percy Maxim, was a car inventor before, a genius in automobile invention. And he actually made silencers for cars and steamboats, oddly enough. So there's an interconnectivity there. Abercrombie & Fitch started its life as a gun store, and at one point in the early 1900s had an 11-story building right by Central Park where you could learn to fly fish in a pool on the roof. You could learn to shoot at a shooting range, and it had everything from dog kennels, and it was the largest seller of mahjong, randomly, in the country. So Abercrombie & Fitch has this connection. And then the last one I want to mention is something that I talk about all the time. I studied about it in grad school, and I love it because it really throws your perception of firearms history and who's been involved within that narrative. And that is that, I kind of started this way. In today's dialogue, a lot of female gun owners really don't like the feminist movement. And the feminist movement often really don't like female gun owners. It's almost like they don't see a middle ground. But what they don't always realize is that there was a portion within the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s that were armed radical women, LGBTQ+ publications that were putting out handguns and self-defense for their communities in order to protect themselves from rape. And so these women kind of pioneered the conversations that you hear with female gun owners, which the big program people know is Refuse to be a Victim program that came out in the 90s by the National Rifle Association. But you've got radical activist women creating pamphlets and advocating for firearms ownership in the 70s, who are the opposite of who you would expect to own guns and advocate for that today. And you also have, a more conservative female base of gun owners who are using rhetoric that dates back to these radical women. And I just think that that is a perfect example of the ways that firearms history can surprise you. And I personally think it is such a good vehicle to unite the conversation, because often I can say something that people don't realize, and then that fuels dialogue. But before we transition, because I know you're going to talk about Bruin, but one of the things that I think is kind of unfortunate, fortunate and unfortunate since the Supreme Court decision last year, is it has thrust history fully into the limelight. History is kind of the foundation now for understanding and determining constitutionality of gun laws. And for the first time, at least in my career, I know I'm young, but 15 years, the first time in my career, I'm seeing the field that I love be used to divide far more than I've seen it used to unite in the past year. The Supreme Court decision ended up kind of pitting historians against one another, and so I don't know where that's going to go. I'm also an expert witness in a lot of these cases, so I share some of the blame as well, but I hope that we can kind of get back to a point where history can be something that's more apolitical, that we can use to have dialogue, to have better knowledge and awareness of firearms technology, because without being able to have a conversation that's civil, we're not going to get anywhere, we're not going to improve anything.
So one of the things you said, Ashley, I think pivots really nicely into what I wanted to ask David about, because David, you've written about your experiences within gun culture and how, this is my culture, but it feels like it's changed in ways that may be a little troubling. And Ashley, when you were talking at the end there, that's the conversation about sort of subcultures within the gun culture and how they map onto things like gender and race that we'll talk about a little more. But David, maybe I'll just invite you to say, what you've seen and written about within the gun culture and maybe how it's changed in recent years, other events or things that have driven that.
Yeah, which I talk pretty slow and I think pretty slow, so I'm just going to try to make a singular point here. But within the gun culture, I would be called what's termed a FUD, which would be that I'm, imagine Elmer Fudd creeping around the woods with a shotgun, right? That's not, and typically it's used as a derogatory term because FUDs tend to be people who are gun owners and even gun enthusiasts, but who are actively wish for gun reform. But so the culture that I grew up with, it doesn't make sense to a lot of people because I grew up in Charlotte, but my family had been there since the 1700s. Uncle lived a mile down the road, still kept rabbit dogs. Gun rack on the wall above the television with, there was 2 shotguns and a .22 rifle. My dad was a squirrel hunter mainly. But so the culture that I come from is tied to that. And the reason that I want to make that point is because the gun culture that we're talking about now is a very new phenomenon. Like we're talking about like a 20-year span. And so for a lot of people who are just growing up nowadays, if you're 18 years old, this is the only thing you know. But if you're 40 years old, maybe even 30 years old, and most certainly if you're older than that, that's not the gun culture that you remember. And so for me, when I try to look at what happened and why I believed that it happened, I think that a couple of different things coincide. One, you have the weapons ban that happens in the Clinton era. When's it? 94. Okay, 94s, right? When's it run out?
2005.
2005, right? And what happens at the start of 2000? 2001. What happens? 9/11. All right. All of a sudden, we've got this moment of we've been attacked on our own soil, and there is rampant nationalism. There is rampant Islamophobia. And for me, those 2 moments in time create something in the gun industry that we hadn't witnessed before. All of a sudden, it wasn't, Walmart selling bolt action rifles. All of a sudden, everything you saw was AR-15s. Everything you saw, all of a sudden you had buckets of ammunition that were being marketed as freedom buckets. All of a sudden, liberty was equated to that. And that's a very real shift that did not exist before that moment. And that's not to say the weapons didn't exist, because the weapons did. And largely the only time you'd ever see them was if you went to a gun show. One of my best friends, I can remember going to a gun show in the late 90s. This is during the weapons ban, and buying an SKS. It wasn't that the guns wasn't there, but nowadays, if you walk into a gun store, that's primarily what you're going to see. I can think about going. I was actually in Savannah, so near Charleston. But I went and stayed with this woman. Her name was Peggy Blood, and I was down there. I was flounder gigging for Garden and Gun magazine, and I go in this little bed and breakfast place, and she said, I want you to do something for me. And me being a giant, she's this little short lady. And me being a giant, she's like in her 80s, I'm thinking she wants me to get something out of the closet. You know, reach something that she can't reach. But she says, I want you to take me to a gun store. And Peggy, little tiny black lady in her mid-80s, and we start having this conversation. And by the end of it, I told her, I said, if you want me to take you to a gun store, I'll take you to a gun store. And so I do. And I knew what was going to happen when we went in there. And immediately they start trying to outfit this woman with an AR-15. And I mean, and they're quite serious about it. We can teach you to shoot this by the end of the afternoon. And finally, when we left there, I said, Peggy, I said, I know you own this big house, you know, and you're worried about people getting into your bedroom and whatnot. And I said, do you got deadbolts on your bedroom door? And she said, no. I said, put a deadbolt on your bedroom door. I said, you got locks on your window? She said, no. I said, put locks on your window. And I told her, I said, if you just absolutely got to have something, I said, get a can of bear spray, you know. But 20 years, you know, 30 years ago, if we'd have walked in that gun store, that's not the gun they would have handed her. But in this moment in time, that's the gun they're going to shove down your throat. And it's largely marketing. And it's very much a deliberate push by that industry to you know, it's the militarization of gun culture. And so for me, it's trying to navigate that world of being somebody who's got a safe full of guns and who shoots guns 3 times a week. I shot a gun this morning. And trying to navigate that world of it evolving into something that I no longer recognize where I fit.
I don't know if this was from the same assignment or not, but when you mentioned the Garden and Gun, it reminds me of the piece you wrote for Garden and Gun, which is a wonderful article y'all should find if you can. And there's a line in there, and I'm going to quote it wrong, but you said something like, everything I know of beauty I learned from rod or rifle, or something from connecting to the natural world. And it's a real beautiful meditation on the kind of gun culture which you described as receding in the face of the militarization. You also mentioned something which maybe will give us a nice pivot to Kelly's work, talking about at least in some quarters, a rise of fear of others, Islamophobia, race. Kelly, you spent a lot of your time working at the intersection of these issues, gun violence, gun rights, and race. Can you give us a snapshot of kind of where things are?
Sure. And I think one of the biggest issues that we have is gun culture exists within American culture. And before I kind of get into my comments, one of the things I would like to preface with is when we're talking about one of the most divisive issues in America, which is guns and gun violence, well, race is right up there with it, and it has been for centuries. And so whenever you talk about race and gun violence, there's a lot of feelings in the room, and I just want to center that. I know that for some people there may be annoyance, like, why do we have to talk about race, or fear, or frustration, or hurt, and the same thing is true with gun violence. There are people who have lost people. There are people who hold their rifles and their tradition of hunting dearly. And so all of those things are in the mix here. But the reason why it is important to talk about race when we talk about guns is, once again, because of our country. And we live in a country where whenever there's a social issue, because we live in a country that was built on white supremacy and still in many ways has systemic racism involved, and all of that to say it's not that a given person is walking around in their heart with animus towards anyone, but there are systems where it's almost mechanized for disadvantage, and you see that we're on the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that's just an example of how nothing in that virus made it more deadly for people of color, and yet we saw death rates higher because of what's known as social determinants of health. And that's the idea that, of course, you have your physical body, but you also, when you're thinking about someone's health, you have to think about the environment they live in, what services they have access to, what sorts of resources are they able to get. And the same thing is true when we look at gun violence. So you mentioned earlier that when you look at gun suicide, that disproportionately impacts older white men. And when you look at gun homicide, it disproportionately impacts young Black people. And the reason why that's the case isn't because there's some inherent violence, or you might hear people talk about Black on Black crime, or there's a culture of violence. But we know that's not true, because if we look at gun violence from a public health perspective, what we find is that there are identifiable root causes for gun violence. One of them, of course, is easy access to firearms, and we can talk about that. But when you pair easy access to firearms with things like trauma, with unemployment, with an inability to resolve conflict coming from trauma, then you can end up with more instances of gun violence. And because of the history in this country where we've had Black people be segregated, disadvantaged economically, and repeatedly traumatized, you end up with higher rates of gun violence in our communities. And that's really important when we're talking about solutions, because oftentimes we use gun violence as an umbrella term. But gun violence refers to many things. It refers to suicide, it refers to police violence, it refers to homicide, which can be domestic violence, it can be mass shootings, and it can be daily violence. And at the point in the conversation where we are right now, while it is true that gun violence is a very divisive issue, and many of you may experience that in your own lives, there's also been an upswell of support for people who are really calling out for gun laws. They may not be calling out for the same gun laws, but there are more and more people who have been energized, especially since Sandy Hook happened over a decade ago. And so what that means is that we're now at the point where, while it may be difficult to get solutions at the national level, we're definitely seeing solutions at the state level and at the federal level in some cases. And so the reason why it's really important to think about race is because we want to make sure that as we're crafting solutions, that we're thinking not just about public mass shootings that you may hear about in the news, but also in the shootings that happen every day in communities of color that you may not hear about, because those may require different sorts of solutions. And so one of the things that Brady does at our organization is we've been thinking a lot about the supply of firearms and how can we make sure that the individuals who are responsible for selling firearms do so in a manner that follows the law and doesn't allow people who shouldn't get guns to have them. And you might be surprised to know that the ATF, which is the federal agency that's responsible for regulating the firearms industry, has for a long time been understaffed and under-resourced. And so there's a group of firearms dealers that we know often turn a blind eye to someone coming in and saying, I can't pass a background check, or allowing guns to go missing. And so if we can cut off those particular dealers while allowing all the other ones who follow the law to continue to sell, that's one way that we can have solutions that not only impact the public mass shootings that you hear a lot about, but also stop guns from flowing into communities of color so that people can have the space to grow up, to go to school, and to become adults. So as you're in your communities and your spaces, and you're thinking about gun violence when the conversations come up, it's definitely important to think not just about, unfortunately, the mass shootings that we hear about year after year after year, but also about what gun violence may look like for people who look like me.
And we've been talking here in some very big, broad, and challenging terms, history and culture, and Kelly's put on the table some legislative potential moves forward. But Chris, one of the things that you said so powerfully last night was that every person comes to this debate with a personal story, a narrative, an experience. And for those who didn't have a chance to hear it last night, I wonder if you could share yours.
Yeah, I will. Well, if you don't mind, if you heard me share last night, can you raise your hand real quick if you heard me share? I figured it'd be most people in here. But basically what I shared was, behind everybody's stance is a story. And even backstage, I was listening to David talk, and I'm learning about his story, and I asked him about kids, and he said he doesn't have kids, and I said, I got too many of them, and so we were joking about that. And, I didn't even, ask him his stance on anything. I was just talking to him about his life and about who he is as a man and as a person. And, for me, when we talk about guns, I didn't aspire to want to, be an activist about guns. I didn't aspire to want to study the history of guns. I didn't aspire to want to learn gun laws. My story of losing my mom forced me into it. And I think there's certain ways you can go when you're forced into an issue like this. You can run away from it, or you can say, I want to try to hit it head on. And that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know a lot about the different types of guns. I don't know a lot about how long guns have been around. I do know what guns have done to my family, and that's what makes it important for me. So that's my personal story, and I'm grateful to be here on this panel with you all to talk about how we can get at some solutions so we're all happy.
So grateful to have you, Chris. And I guess now that we're juggling a lot of difficult issues, including partisan divide, race, we should put another one on the table, really tough, which within the gun debate, I think is one that people have a real hard time talking about, but Ashley and I have talked about because it's important personally to both of us. That's a relationship between mental health and guns, which is, I think, and Ashley's written very powerfully on this, way more complicated than either side often treats it. So Ashley, I just invite you to say what you like.
Article?
I did read
Terrifying.
that article.
So to preface this, I'm not a psychologist. I don't have a background in kind of the science behind, or behavioral science of firearms, although I'm trying to read up on it, because I came to this part of the gun debate much later because I was unaware that I have bipolar II disorder, and I also have PTSD stemming predominantly from a stalker that I had when I was in Wyoming. Sorry. And so one of the things that I realized when I was trying to seek help initially, I tried to start getting help in Wyoming. It was very difficult in a town of 9,000 people because the therapist kept leaving. So I never really, found my footing. And then I was in Phoenix. I live in Phoenix, Arizona now, and I was able to get more help. And I'm going to be honest. I was diagnosed with depression, and I feel like you hear that so much. It's almost accepted, right? Terribly, but it's almost accepted. And I remember when I had a horrible reaction to a medication, and that is what told my psychiatrist that I had bipolar disorder. And it was so stigmatized in my brain that I lied on the test to try to make sure I didn't get diagnosed with it. Went home for Thanksgiving, and then about a week later, I made an appointment, and the psychiatrist was like, "Why are you here?" And I'm like, "Well, I have bipolar disorder." And so I kept this inside for a year, maybe more, and I got so fed up of all the people that follow my career and applaud my work in one form, and then will say, well, crazy people this and crazy people that. And they would say it on my social media, and I was like, and this is a terrible term to reappropriate, but I'm a crazy person, so when you're talking about that, you're talking about me. And so I finally, I think last year or something, I came out publicly with my mental health diagnoses because I wanted people, because I do have a very public face. I've had TV shows within the gun community, the gun history community. I wanted people to know that this is okay to talk about. And what happened from that was that I was inundated in my DMs, on my phone, of people in the gun industry, in the gun community, who told me that they have bipolar disorder or they have different mental health problems, but that they're so scared of speaking up, of getting help, that they just kind of push it down. And that's why, I think the stats are the same, that more than 60% of firearms deaths are death by firearm, or suicide, death by suicide, sorry. And it's something I feel like we don't talk about nearly enough. It doesn't get as much time, and it's a complicated subject. I know we're probably going to talk more about that. But one thing that I think is interesting is we seem to talk about it so often, but it's the gun community themselves who are pretty much always the ones that are killing themselves. And the stigma that comes from not just outside the gun community, but it's very, very powerful within the gun community. Currently, I sit on a board for an organization called Walk the Talk America, and we work with the gun community to start reducing those stigmas, but then we also work with the mental health community, because there are very few people within that community that fully understand gun ownership, and there's a lot of there's a lot of room to make a judgment on if you own a firearm and you're having a problem, at what point, do you intervene, should you intervene, that kind of question. So they actually do a cultural competency course for mental health professionals to try to start to bring that divide together. But there are, a lot of ways that I know that Walk the Talk is working with it. You mentioned good gun stores. There are now gun stores that are working to take people's firearms temporarily if they're having a time of crisis. The biggest issue that we're dealing with, and actually the University of Wyoming College of Law, we're hosting a CLE this fall for federal firearms license holders because they're concerned about, if I take these firearms in to help protect this person and I give it back to them and something happens, what is my liability? So they want to help, but they don't know how to help or where the lines are in helping. And so it's a very big issue. Like I said, I'm not an expert in it, but it's very personal to me. And so I just kind of want to talk about it as much as possible, even though it's a little uncomfortable, because it is a large part of this. And I think that both sides, I hate both sides, I hate that. It's a spectrum. All sides of this debate, it's a very complicated topic that not a lot of people know a lot about. And the term mental health and mental illness is thrown around very generally, and often we don't know what that means.
That's good. I want to touch on that real quick as well, just because I work a lot in schools around the country, and some of the school districts I get to serve, a lot of kids that look like me, black and brown kids, underserved communities that have tons of guns in their schools, right? I walk in, there's metal detectors in some of these schools, some of them don't have them. And what I started to think about when it comes to their mental health of these kids, number one, they don't know how to process their emotions. And so what happens to a kid that's in an underserved community that has access to guns, whether legal or not illegal, probably not legal, what happens is a kid that's scared, in a situation where he's scared, he pulls out his gun, right? What happens is when he feels like he's humiliated in front of his peers, what does he do? He pulls out his gun. And so he doesn't know how to process those emotions, and he instantly wants to use that firearm that he has. And so I think, whether it's the social emotional learning that they have to figure out with, how to process what they're going through, how to sit in their emotions and be humiliated and be okay, I think is super important. So I also applaud you from not running from that, because there's a lot of kids across the country that are running from those emotions, and when they feel like they're, for lack of better words, their manhood is tested, if they have that firearm, they're gonna pull it out.
If I can ask a follow-up on that, Chris, when you talk about guns in schools, and this is something I don't think you talked about last night, you've been involved in efforts using, frankly, innovation. Ashley was talking earlier about the ways that the gun industry itself has driven innovation in a technological way in ways that sort of rebound throughout the country, throughout other industries. But you've been involved in some really interesting, innovative, technological approaches about the problem of guns in schools. Can you say about that?
Yeah, I have. And so the reason why I joined the board of this organization is because I felt like, hey, I'm doing as much as I can as far as hearts, but I wasn't doing as much as I could as far as policy. Now, policy doesn't change people at all, but I figured I want to be on both sides. What could I do? And I found this company called Evolve Technology, and what they do is they put weapons detection systems in, SoFi Stadium, Wrigley, Mercedes-Benz Stadium, but they also, their biggest client is in schools across the country. And when they approached me, I basically was asked if I'd known some schools that would need it, and I said, absolutely, right? There's tons of schools that can't afford this technology, and if we can give it away, that'd be beneficial. And so for the last 2 years, that's what I've been helping do, whether it's in LA, whether it's in Chicago. We've been trying to partner with different school districts to put this technology into the schools. Now, what I will say is, when we put this technology, it doesn't look like a metal detector, number one. And so that's why I think it's gone into so many big stadiums, because people don't feel like criminals, walking in there under the metal detector. It just looks like something that could be right there. You wouldn't even be able to tell. But one thing it does, it detects it, right? It doesn't mean that, they automatically get shocked and the gun falls out of their pocket and then everybody screams. No, that's not what happens. And so there has to be somebody there that is there to stop that from entering the building. And in the year 2020, from all their weapons detection systems across the country, over 100,000 weapons were detected and stopped from entering, whether it's a Wrigley or whether it's a school. And it wasn't just firearms, but it was also, hunting knives or whatever the knife that they were bringing into their school that was detected. And so I think going into the future, this will be in a lot more places. And my wish would be that it'd be in grocery stores or whatever it may be, and there'd be somebody at the entrance that could stop them immediately when that happens. So that's what my hope is, and I think technology is going to help us make this country in the world a better place.
And we sort of made our pivot here to talking about some solutions, which I think is great. We laid out some really, really difficult problems, and I'll just note that both Ashley and Chris's comments were about ways forward, right? We changed norms about the way we talk about problems. We look for technology, maybe innovative solutions. Another possibility, of course, is law, is legislation. And I wonder, Kelly, if you could give us sort of a snapshot of that, especially in light of everything big we've seen from Congress and the Supreme Court. What's the legal landscape look like?
Gotcha. And I just am curious, how many of you are familiar with the Bruin case from last year? Okay, so I should probably give a little bit more background. So I'm just going to do the short answer up front, and then I'll go backwards. So I would say that the Bruin case in some ways rewrote the Second Amendment, but all hope for policy is not lost. So to rewind, the Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's what it said. And believe it or not, despite the controversies of the Second Amendment today and how it's sort of at the forefront of the gun debate we have now, for a lot of our history, the Second Amendment was what one scholar called a constitutional backwater, because in many ways it wasn't thought of as part of gun regulation. There were plenty of gun regulations throughout our history, but it wasn't thought of in sort of these individual Second Amendment terms. What happened was that there was a deliberate campaign, and just to tell you guys where I'm coming from an organization that works to prevent gun violence, so there it is up front. So if you sense a posture here, I do have one. I just need to make it clear. But there was a deliberate campaign that began kind of around the 60s to effectively reframe the Second Amendment from this sort of collective militia-based right to where we are now. And what happened was that the NRA and some of their allies, they first seeded scholarship that was putting law review articles out basically saying the Second Amendment was actually an individual right, despite this whole militia thing. And then they also worked with the public to sort of convince people that the Second Amendment was an individual right, and also to make the Second Amendment from a constitutional backwater to a part of the conversation where Americans started to think of it as not just their right, but their rights, plural. And so you have this synergy between the academic space and the public, and you start to see it enter politics in a way that it hadn't before. And of course, politics is how we elect our judges. And so it got to the point where you started to have judges who, part of the litmus test was, what do they think about the Second Amendment? And so we end up in this place in 2008 where the Supreme Court decides for the first time in our history that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep a firearm in the home for self-defense. That case was Heller, but it left a lot on the table. Because after Heller, although you could no longer ban firearms in the home, there were still a lot of unanswered questions. And so after Heller, you saw states and municipalities begin to pass all manner of firearms laws, because after Heller was decided in 2008, of course, we had so many mass shootings, including Sandy Hook, which really galvanized a lot of Americans to start to demand gun solutions. So we have Heller, which says individual right, you can't ban firearms in your home. We have a lot of gun laws, and there's all these open questions. One of them is, does the Second Amendment apply inside the home? The other one was, what is the standard that a court should use if a gun law is challenged? And I don't know how many of you are attorneys, so I'm gonna try to, I don't wanna be too wonky, but basically, Heller, in that case, what the Supreme Court did, they said whether or not you could ban firearms in the home, and they also put out some words around, we should have longstanding regulations. They didn't really say what a court should do if they're faced with a gun law challenge. So the federal and state courts created their own standard after Heller, and basically that standard was two parts. The first part asked whether a given law concerned a core Second Amendment right, and if so, then the next question was, does the government have a substantial interest that would allow for it to infringe on the Second Amendment in this way? So to put that in layman's terms, it's basically after Heller, courts would look at whether or not a gun law concerned the Second Amendment, but also the government had an opportunity to put forth briefing to say, yes, we passed this assault weapons ban because it would save this many lives, or yes, we passed this age limit because we think it's going to protect our people in this way. So that brings us to last year, where we're in this place where there's gun laws, they're being upheld, they're being challenged, there's this standard. The Bruin case, which was decided last year, did two really significant things. The first thing that the Bruin case did is that it established that the Second Amendment applies outside the home. That has sort of been the assumption after Heller, but it had never been confirmed by the Supreme Court. So they did that. But arguably, the thing they did that was more important and more relevant to the state of policy now is that the Supreme Court in Bruin said that two-part test, where the government has an opportunity to say why they passed a law or to sort of make some claim about public safety, we're not doing that. What we're going to do is ask first whether or not a gun law concerns the Second Amendment, and then secondly, if so, rather than going to some science-based or evidence-based background, you have to make the claim, government, that your law from 2022 or 2023 is relevantly similar to a historical law. That opened up a can of worms because, as you can imagine, when you say relevantly similar, but you don't define what that means, it can be whatever you want it to, especially if, to your point, history, that is its own discipline. There are people who are experts in it. They go to school for it. They know how to deal with primary source documents and the like. Attorneys, we're coming into court, we're representing a party. It's an adversarial condition. And so we're making arguments, but we're not historians. And so after Bruin, what that meant is that I can go in and have my historians, and someone on the other side can go in and have their historians, and it's up to a judge to decide whether or not a law is relevantly similar. And if you decide to go really narrow, you can come out one way. If you decide to go really broad, you can come out the other way. And I realize I'm talking long, so the last thing I will say on this front, just to give you an example of what that looks like, is we've had so many laws that have been well accepted for decades be overturned after Bruin. And the most prominent and egregious one is the case that involved the federal law prohibiting those under a domestic violence restraining order from possessing firearms. And the argument was that that law doesn't really have a historical analog because in early America, they didn't really have domestic violence restraining orders. That's ridiculous because you could also go to a higher level of generality and say that in early America, there were plenty of laws that kept people who were considered dangerous at the time from possessing firearms. And so that is sort of where we are now, where we're in this Pandora's box, where you may have one circuit uphold a law and another circuit overturn the very same law based on history as done by attorneys representing parties. So we're kind of in a mess. The Supreme Court may take that case. We'll find out very soon, actually. The last thing I'll say is that despite this chaos, that doesn't mean that we still can't regulate and pass firearms laws. And just this year, we've had many, many states pass extremist protection orders, age limits, because there's plenty of history to support a given law. It just depends on the level at which you're analyzing it.
That was a perfect encapsulation, Kelly, of an enormous amount of constitutional law. To do all that in a few minutes was amazing. That's a lot. This is where I spend my time teaching and writing, and I've never done it so well as Kelly just did. But Ashley, I did want to invite you, if you wanted to say something about, since you're involved in a lot of these cases, as a person who, as you raised earlier, doing the history before Bruin threw it really to the front. Like, what's it like? I mean, to be called in as an historical expert to testify in a case about domestic violence restraining order or something else, or guns on subways or some more recent kind of a law?
Yeah, it's way different than it used to be in terms of when I'd be hired. Now, I've done expert witness testimony on anything from product liability on historic firearms, where somebody uses a firearm, hurts themselves, but the gun's not been made for a really long time. I worked on a murder case up in Canada, which is super random. But then I have been doing a lot of the Second Amendment cases, and I remember working on one of the assault weapons cases in California. And I was working for the plaintiff, not the state. And I just provided a history of the technology, and that's kind of where I focus. And it was a wonderful experience because there was such a great dialogue that went on between, at least when I was deposed and when I testified, between the state and myself and our attorneys. And I remember the state attorney just thanking me at the end of the deposition because he was like, that was so helpful. I didn't know any of that. Thank you for not yelling at me, I think was the exact words he used. I'm like, why would I yell at you? But thank you for not getting emotional about it. Thank you for not, judging that I don't know. And that's why I did it. That's why I did it. And since Bruin, it's gotten very volatile, very personal. We talk about, mental health, and I will just say it's been bad for me because it's a lot of personal attacks rather than argumentative attacks that are going on. And whatever, I took the job, it's my fault. But I would say that I'm disappointed in kind of where it is right now. I'm still working on some cases, but I don't think I will be doing it much longer because I think I can impact the public a lot more by just educating and not getting caught in the crosshairs of these cases. It didn't used to be that way, but now it is. If you're hired by a side, then you are automatically that side. And that to some experts, that's the case. To others, it's not. But there have been a lot of I don't want to say this sounds dramatic, assassinations on my character, but a lot of people inferring a lot of things about me that are not true or don't reflect my beliefs, do not reflect, one of the best examples, and I'm going to say the bad three-letter word, is I am an NRA Life member. Why am I an NRA Life member? Because I worked for Cody, and Cody worked with the National Firearms Museum, which is a part of the National Rifle Association. I also sat on a committee that served as their board. I am not a fan of the NRA right now. And so I've been vocal about that, but the only part that gets talked about is they cut off the part where I say I'm not, in support of the current, NRA, but they leave that I'm an NRA Life member. And I just don't think that I want to be able to think critically and be challenged, that's fine, but I do it in a way that's honest and you're not trying to rip apart pieces of somebody's life when we're really talking about history. And that's been, I'm going to be honest, it's been the hardest 6 months of my life. And I had a stalker, so it's definitely been tough. And so I'm still, like I said, I'm still doing it. I finished a case this morning, but I think that I can have a much greater impact working with different organizations and keep maintaining the nonpartisanship that is so important to me. Because right now in the political and the legislative world, it's not possible to do that right now.
It's a really amazing window, Ashley, into the world that even where you imagine a courtroom, expert witness testimony, where the ideas should be first, that still things can get so personal so quickly. And I'm sure all of us who've been in the field have had these experiences, whether it's one-on-one or sort of more broadly, but rarely with exactly that kind of venom. Where you ended there maybe is where I'll take direct, I guess, maybe the last question here for David, which is about, the gun debate proceeds, I think, on so many different levels of generality. Kelly was talking about this in terms of historical analogs, but there's a tendency, it feels like to me, to hop back and forth between like really broad, are you for or against guns, to like really specific. And you've thought about that question as well, like what should we be talking about when we talk about gun reform?
Well, I think the hard thing, so the piece that I wrote for the New York Times Magazine about gun culture, we worked on over the course of about a year and a half. And honestly, it had been easier to write a novel. And the problem is that the conversation is like trying to hold water. Like it's constantly slipping through your fucking fingers. And so if we go back and we think, all right, let's think about the shooting in the Buffalo, New York grocery store. All right, now let's focus on that. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to focus on a man walking into a predominantly black grocery store and shooting these people down. That's what we're going to focus on. What happened a week later? Uvalde, right? All of a sudden, nobody's talking about Buffalo anymore. And to be honest, they're still not. And they're talking about Uvalde. And that's not to say that one is more important than the other, but that is to say that you can't stay focused on a singular point because things are happening so often that the conversation is fluid. And that's the most difficult and challenging thing of this entire conversation, is that we're never standing in one place because the problem is so, I'm bad at cussing, so overwhelming. But so the thing that really frustrates me is that when we begin to talk about these things, it's always as if there can't be steps taken. No steps can be taken. And the truth is that you're already accepting all types of terms, right? Like, for instance, Title II under federal law, like what I can own. I can't own machine guns. I can't own short-barreled rifles. I can't own short-barreled shotguns. And if I want to own these things, there are avenues to do that, but it's a lot more paperwork, and there's a whole lot more things that go into that. I can't walk into the local gun store and pick it up in a day. And so you're already accepting all of these things, right? And so when the conversation gets to, I don't want anything to be limited, you're already limited. But there's all of these things that continue to slip through the cracks that make no sense to me. So for instance, and these are simple things like bump stocks, for instance. Like, you know, when Stephen Paddock was using bump stocks in Las Vegas. But anything that's being added to a gun to increase rate of fire makes no sense why I ought to be able to just go pick it up. I think there are all kinds of things that slip through the cracks that make no sense. And the truth is that a ton of it, you know, the legislation wouldn't have stopped somebody like Stephen Paddock. You know, somebody who was that meditative and who planned things out that long, it's going to happen. But it would have stopped tons of other people. You know, I've always wanted a news agency to give me the money and let me walk into a gun store and let me show them what I could buy in an hour. I want to, and we can go to Hazelwood Tactical right there in Waynesville, and you can give me $3,000, and within an hour I could have 3 AR-15s, and I could probably have, you know, 5,000 rounds of ammunition, and I could have, you know, 50 magazines. That's ludicrous. That makes no sense. Nobody should be able to do that. Nobody. And these are that is a common sense thing. And so often in this we get so riled up, and it's it's that whole cutting off your nose. You know, we're not getting anywhere, and there are logical steps that can be taken. And so for me, the frustrating thing, people get tied up on language. You know, it's that we can't even have a conversation because nobody will agree on terms. You know, I've thought for a long time that one of the biggest things that could happen, a presidential move, would just be to get the terms set to where we're all having the same conversation. Because then when somebody says assault weapons and you're, well, what is an assault weapon? Is it? And nobody knows what the hell anybody's talking about, you know? And there are very simple things, and there are some very smart people who can make those things happen. And what continues to win out over and over again, because it's American as white supremacy, is money. It's capitalism. That's the reason things don't get done in this country, and that's sickening to me. And so for me, I think like where I want the conversation to eventually go is like how do you stop things like that? Or like in North Carolina, we just made it easier to get handguns, right? Like, and part of that, I do understand that, because places like Mecklenburg County were inundated. Like those sheriff's office could not handle the amount of handgun purchase permits that they were having to put through. But at the same time, the idea that you just walk in and get one, you know, I think that law is a good law. I don't have a problem with waiting for nothing. Hell, I waited for a damn cheeseburger for 20 minutes at the McDonald's on the way over here. I'm patient. And there's nothing that I need a gun for that I need it for right this minute, right? Like, if somebody walks in, I need a gun now, there's a problem. There's a problem.
I want to really echo what David just pointed out about the importance of getting specific, because I started us off with this sort of, you know, there's a 60-point gap between Republicans and Democrats on the broad question of whether it's more important to protect gun rights or to regulate them, and that's true. But if you ask follow-up specific questions, it looks a lot different. So, for example, depending on the poll, 85 to 90% of Americans support expanded federal background checks, right? That cuts across gun owners, NRA members, Republicans, Democrats. If you ask the specific questions, you often find that there's a lot more agreement on what I think most people regard as sort of common sense gun reform. Before we get to the Q&A, I want to ask just one last question. This is for everyone on the panel, but a lot of what we've been sort of seeing throughout the whole event here is sort of effort to engage with priors and to really sort of think like what's misunderstood, right? And so I wanted to invite everybody from whatever corner of the gun debate you find yourself, right? Whoever your interlocutors are, whatever your sort of, you know, as Ashley said earlier, it's not just two sides, and we've hopefully shown that. This is not just pro or anti-gun. But whatever kind of camp or corner you're in, what's most misunderstood in that camp? Not about it, but within it. Like the people who you work with at Brady, or the people who, you know, who you work with in curating firearms history. What do they most misunderstand kind of about others? This is an invitation to be a little, not self-critical, but like, here's what I wish the people I talk to better understood, as opposed to what do I wish people understood more about me.
Yeah, I'll go first real quick. So I don't think it should be a, when I think about guns, I think about terrible things happening, I think about whatever it may be. It shouldn't be, well, what happened before, or it should always be, hey, wrong is wrong. And I think sometimes, as soon as something terrible happens, instead of just saying wrong is wrong, we start, well, maybe it should have been, wrong is wrong. And I think that should be across the board. We're all anti-mass shooting, right? Whether you're anti-gun or pro-gun or whatever, everybody's anti-mass shooting. If you're not, then I don't want to be around you. I don't think anybody wants to, right? If you're not anti-mass shooting, right? And so I think that's important. We're all in the same, you know, it should be 100% no school shooting, right? I don't think anybody that loves guns would say, you know what, I don't mind a school shooting. No, they don't want those either. So we're all on the same side with certain things. We have to figure out how we can stop it from happening together. So I think that's important. I hate choosing sides because nobody's just one way. And so for me, we're all on the side of stopping mass shootings and stopping school shootings from happening. And we gotta work together to make it stop happening. So I love talking about like random ideas and solutions. That's what I like to talk about. You know, we talked about a couple of them, but I just sent out like a Twitter poll to everybody because I don't like guns, and everybody knows I don't like them, but I still love people that love them. And so I was asking people that love them, well, what should we do, right? And I was getting solutions like, well, Chris, you know, there's so many retired veterans that, you know, are gun owners that could, you know, work security. We should pay them this. They need jobs. And so I got that solution. Some people said, well, Chris, teachers are underpaid. We should, you know, any teacher that volunteers to, you know, have a gun in the school should be paid, you know, $15,000 more. I'm asking all this stuff. These are the answers I'm getting, right? So I like to hear solutions. And so I just ask people, what is it? And I get stuff back, and I think that's important because we can talk about wanting to change stuff, but just ask somebody what their solution would be, right? That's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear, I mean, I should know what it feels like to go through loss like this. And I have solutions. I throw them out there. If you don't like them, okay, cool. You don't like them. But I want to hear solutions, right? I don't want to hear people talking about, well, I want to make sure I feel safe. Okay, you feel safe, and then tell me your solution right after, okay? That's what I think the answer should be. And I encourage you guys to have those conversations with your friends and your family too. They're not going to think like you do, but hear what their solution would be. It could be something really dumb, but at least you got a solution and you hear what they got to say. So I think that's important.
So this is a difficult question for me, because Brady, so some of my coworkers are like formal law enforcement, some of them are hunters, some of them are like me, I've never, you know, fired a gun. So Brady itself is sort of made up of a lot of different people. So when you ask what is the thing that we misunderstand as a group, the one thing I was thinking of that I think unites is we work on gun violence prevention all day. So we think about gun law, gun policy, gun culture, whatever. And one of the things I've learned from young people who've come into the movement is that the young people, I should say, who are like, I want to prevent gun violence, do not think of it in a silo. And I think it's a mistake to think about preventing gun violence as a panacea, or preventing gun violence as just being about universal background checks or something of the like. We support them, but especially gun violence as it impacts communities that have been traumatized for decades and that are under-resourced. When I talk to people in those communities, it's not just we want to pass gun laws. It's like we want to pass gun laws, we want opportunities, we want the ability to vote, we want climate justice, and so gun violence is really linked to a lot of social problems, and you have to think about them that way.
I don't think there's anything misunderstood about me because I just say it like it is. And so I lay it all out on the table, everything I think, and so it's just kind of is what it is. But I would say, as far as what I'm on this panel to represent, as far as, how your average gun owner is misunderstood. I think one of the biggest outreaches that took place after that essay for New York Times Magazine was all of these people who wanted me to start another organization that would be the opposite of the NRA, right? That's not me. I just want to go live in the woods and be left alone. But what I'm getting at is that there were all of these gun owners who actively wanted an organization to represent their interests, and they felt absolutely abandoned and no attachment at all to the NRA. That part of that population never has a voice in the conversation, really. If they're going to have a gun owner on a television show, he's I ought to be able to own nukes if I want one. Whatever. And so I think the people that continue to get misunderstood is that there are a whole lot of people out there who own a whole lot of guns and who use guns, often, who would love to see gun reform. I could take you to a gun shop within an hour here right now, and it'd be filled full of old men that's from these mountains, and every one of them sitting there to tell you they want gun reform. And if you ask them about solutions, they might not be able to figure it out, but they could have that conversation. But the point being that you're never hearing from that group, and they exist.
So mine's kind of just, I say this all the time, people always say facts are facts, and a lot of times I'll be doing a presentation and someone will cut me off and be like, see, facts are facts, and I'm like, stop it. Because, half the time in the museum world or the history world, I could give you 3 different almost dates for the invention of some things. That's why I like circa is like my favorite thing. Because we, so often we know it might have been in this decade, but a lot of times you'll see multiple dates for everything. And the fact that, I would interpret facts in a certain way doesn't mean that other people see that the same way. The expert witness testimony shows you that very, very much, and that's great because it helps us get to a greater understanding. But yeah, facts aren't just facts. I mean, there's always an interpretation on them. You can always, argue a number or whatever. And I think that if you realize that it's not black and white like that, then you can have a much better dialogue.
It's a fantastic place for the presentations in, but we have time for Q&A, about 10 minutes. If you have a question, please come to the mic.
This question is primarily for Kelly, I guess. I'm wondering what, you talk about precedent, and the law makes a big deal about precedents, yet the NRA in the 60s supported gun control when there was increased black ownership of guns. Is that ever brought up in any of these I mean, I know that wasn't, but there was, right? Was it Bulworth or Bulward tried to actually do an act? Wolford, yeah, okay. So, I mean, they tried to do this legally. The NRA tried to limit gun ownership in a population that they did not want owning guns. Is that ever brought up in any of these trials, or can that be used, not used against them, but can that be used to frame the argument in any way today?
Yes and no. So it's brought up sometimes, but to the point, I feel like one of the common themes here is complexity. And oftentimes, people will use that as a reason why we shouldn't have gun laws. The argument would be, well, that just shows that if you're trying to regulate guns today, it's racist. So it comes up in this really interesting rhetorical frame where you'll have, Ted Cruz or someone who is not necessarily known for caring about race, all of a sudden using that to sort of argue why we shouldn't have gun laws. So it does come up, but I think to your point about precedent, we actually have cases, United States v. Miller, for example, where there's legal precedent from the Supreme Court showing that you can regulate a firearm. That case basically said if something is, I'm going to misstate it, but it tied a gun regulation to the fact that it wasn't really helpful for militia in that case. So there's precedent, but what's been happening in Bruin and some of the lower courts is that it's just cherry picking, where even you'll see Justice Thomas do it in Bruin, where he says that history is cool, that history not so much, those laws are relevant, those aren't. So I think as an advocate, you can use whatever suits your argument to make the argument, but it's not clear what the justices are going to do with it.
I know that most people have used the Second Amendment and, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed, but what about the first part? A well-regulated militia be necessary for the security of a free state. I was maybe mistaught in high school, but we were taught that that was because they didn't want a standing army in the streets. And we don't, historically have a standing army in the streets anymore, but we do have police. And the police, I understood, was there instead of everybody having their own well-regulated militia. Has that argument been tried? And that's my question. And I does want to also say something about the mental health issue. 1 month after my son's 21st birthday, he shot himself in the head in front of me and killed himself with his brother on the telephone trying to stop him. He had been getting some mental health treatment for several years, and it was probably schizophrenia that he had, that he was hearing voices tell him to do things, and he was really afraid. And if he hadn't had a gun to shoot himself in the head, would he have tried some other means of suicide? Maybe so. But the fact of the matter is, I listen now, and there's medication now for schizophrenia that's going to fix that problem. And if he hadn't been able to get a gun so easily, he bought it on the street from some kid he knew in high school. So these guns are there. And his last words were, "I love you, Mom. I love you, Max," his brother. And it's devastating. It's devastating to the family. It's devastating to somebody like Chris, whose mother is a victim of an assault, and we just sit here and ignore it. So how about trying to do the well-regulated militia part?
I'll say first on the second part, thank you. I think this is echoing Ashley's message earlier. The first, I think, important step for better conversations about mental health and guns are to actually have conversations about mental health and guns, and that's often very hard. It's hard to even hear a devastating incident like that. I can give a very quick on the well-regulated militia, because Kelly gave a quick rundown of the Supreme Court case in District of Columbia versus Heller from 2008, when that was the central case. And I should say, in the interest of full disclosure here, that I was one of the attorneys on that case representing the district, which was the losing side. So take this for what you will. But there were essentially two competing visions of the Second Amendment before the Supreme Court. One, that the people, arms, and activities covered by the amendment must have some connection to the organized militia, which is sort of maybe what's suggested by the first clause. The second is that the right extends beyond that to include a right to have a gun in the home for self-defense at least, and maybe some other private purposes. And so the argument was made, and the court rejected it in a 5-4 decisions, quite lengthy, a lot of historical analysis. I would add just one, and I'm happy to go on about that one at length, have a book on it, if anybody wants something less interesting than David's, a sedative book. Highly recommend my own. But I would say this, I would just add this, that was, in some respects, the Supreme Court changing the law. It was the first time a law was struck down on Second Amendment grounds in this country's history. but it was very much in keeping with where the American people were at that time. So 75% of Americans at the time Heller was decided said they supported the decision. It happened during the Obama-McCain early stages of that campaign. Both President Obama, or eventually President Obama, and John McCain came out and said, I support this individual right as well. So there was a massive cultural shift underlying that legal change. I think we probably have time for one more question.
Thank you. So I'm gun naive, never had one, never shot one. So looking at just the numbers of the politics when they say 87% want background checks, this much want training, a license, right? All these things. Is it too simple? Like, what's in it for the NRA? Is it just money? Is it just we'll sell less guns if we get all those things? Or are there things that I'm missing? Is this really just profit driven and manufacture? Or am I missing something?
Well, I think, I mean, I don't do the politics side of it, but working a lot with the gun community and, you know, in Cody and all of that, I think the one thing that I've at least seen from an expert witness testimony standpoint is when you're writing a lot of these laws, and I always tell people it's not my job to tell you what to think or how to do that law, but I'm going to give you information, you do what you will with it. I find that sometimes the wording of the laws gets so, you know, neutered down, or there are things that are not, you know, enforceable. And so, you know, not to speak to the NRA, but in general, when people oppose these things, it's the nuance of it, it's the complexity of it, and I don't think it's just for profit. As I work with people all across the board, but there's always, I guess, I'm like rambling, but when I spoke in front of Congress or the Senate, I talked about terms that we use, so universal background checks. And the one thing that I always like to try is to be precise, because there are words that we can get behind that sound like they're, you know, sound good, but then when you actually read the law, you know, it doesn't always do that. And so that's where, like, I think there gets some confusion, because, and I told my friends this, you know, I don't care how you feel about, you know, a certain law, everybody should be mad when the law ends up not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And so that's where a lot of the fight back and forth goes, is because of the way the laws are actually worded, you know, what's in them. And then also there are, you know, how would it affect the gun community and that kind of thing. But I don't believe it's just for profit, no.
We'll return at the end to where we began, talking about precision in language. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.
David, I'm gonna put you on the spot and give you the last word.
I think it is. Thank you. Good night.
Make a hasty exit. What is the number one thing that you want the folks in this room to know about you as a gun owner? Something that they may not know or understand about you?
Again, I think it's that there are a whole lot of people that, you know, that have ideas of what reform could look like, and who want that. You know, the access to guns in this country is just dumbfounding. You know, that second novel I wrote is dedicated to one of my best friends who in Asheville walked into his house, shot his brother, shot his daddy, and killed himself. You know, very much, he was a veteran. He was a Marine, and part of that initial, you know, movement into Iraq when they just took off for Baghdad, you know, but very much a mental health issue. But how easily you can access something. I know that it would dumbfound every single person in this room if you handed me $3,000 and we rode to Waynesville and I showed you what I could buy in an hour. It would dumbfound you. And how you change that, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not going to sit in there and talk to them, because don't call me to be your expert witness. But there has to be solutions. I mean, you know, and I think that the majority of gun owners agree that there are things that we can do, because he's absolutely right. There's nobody who wants school shootings. There's nobody who wants mass shootings. Nobody.
Thank you for that. And, you know, Chris, I heard something you said earlier about you want solutions, right? And I would argue that that in a complex issue like this, the best way we can get to solutions is actually begin with dialogue, the kind of dialogue that we had today, the kind of dialogue that you shared with all of us. So thank you very, very much for that, all four of you. And